world where resource scarcity is becoming increasingly important, organizations are looking for a strategic way of evaluating this environmental risk and what impact it might have on their businesses and operations. In short, managing this risk, like any other, is becoming critical in business terms. But what is natural capital, and how do we or should we account for it? Well, that's our focus today on Earthfile. Welcome to the program. I am Ayola Kasim. Simply put, there are 4 natural capital accounting categories. They are air, water, land, and biodiversity, and all are interdependent. These provide us with the crucial renewable and non-renewable resources and environmental services that benefit society as a whole.
The Amazon forest is not measured by the wealth of timber that stands in it, but is measured by the cost that will arise to South America if it ceases to function as the world's largest water pump, which de facto the Amazon ecosystem is. Or if we start measuring mangroves and coastal wetland forests and the forests in general in terms of their carbon capture and storage capacity. Nobody ever thought about that when they talked about forests 20 years ago. Today we know that much of the carbon dioxide that has actually been captured and stored is captured through nature's services. And we also talk about supply chains. We talk about resource constraints. We talk about essentially running out of a lot of things, whether it's arable land or whether it's water, to try and sustain a population that in the next 30 years again will grow by another 2 to 3 billion people. How on earth will we feed ourselves? The idea that technology and science in the 21st century means that we are independent from nature has been fairly harshly contradicted by the fact that when you look at our atmosphere, at our biosphere, at our oceans in the world, you realize that in fact we are not independent from nature. On the contrary, with 250 years of unbridled mining of the planet, what we're actually confronted with at the beginning of the 21st century is rediscovering nature as the foundation for future development.
Forest degradation, for example, all over the world, it's an issue that requires complementary legislation in different countries. It also has a trade-off effect on climate change policies as well, or climate change laws as well, because these trees that we cut down, they serve as carbon sinks, and then as long as we continue to engage in intensive deforestation, we are losing our natural capital. And then we also believe that because there is no value attached to the kind of ecosystem, I call them ecosystem services. There are certain services we derive from the environment, but in Nigeria and so many other countries, even in some developed countries, they don't have a value attached to it. So there's this new concept called the economics of ecosystems, which means they are now beginning to look at the environment as an economic entity, which means laws of economic laws will now also be applied to dealing with conserving the environment.
The ability to account for these environmental assets and their rate of depletion, commonly referred to as stocks flows, is variable. In a limited number of cases, such as fossil fuel, the thinking is already advanced, although significant challenges still remain.
When we think of inequality, we need to think not just inequalities of income, but also inequalities in terms of vulnerability. And we know that low-income groups are most vulnerable to environmental stress, water, soils, air pollution, and also increasing natural hazards exacerbated by climate change. So I think the link is very strong, and certainly I think one of the areas that is very exciting to look at is actually how we look at sort of access to finance for green economy investments. I mean, there's a lot of focus in the investment world on what is called impact investing, and I think the ways whereby you can actually target investments which get a decent return, but also have positive impacts on reducing inequality is a big focus in finance at the moment.
However, the failure to account for many more environmental services, especially those which are less visible, for example, clean air provided by forests, flood protection provided by wetlands, and crop pollination provided by bees.
I think there's going to be an ongoing tension as resources become more scarce. How is that balance defined locally? and then more broadly, I think, between nation states themselves, because ultimately we are on a planet, right? It has physical limits, and so this is the real question: how do we live together in more, can I say, more peacefully? You know, that's sort of a trite way of putting it, but I think we have to change our mindsets. And so the other part of this is how we look at wealth. Just to end on this point, the natural capital accounting has some really interesting aspects because it looks at wealth more broadly, not just money, not just reserves of oil, but actually natural wealth.
The concept of accounting for natural capital has been around for more than 30 years. To date, however, progress moving beyond conceptual thinking towards practical implementation of natural capital valuation has been slow. Barriers to implementation include the lack of internationally agreed methodologies for ecosystem valuation, a lack of uptake of natural capital accounting by policymakers, especially finance ministers, capacity limitations in many developing countries, and the lack of leadership in moving beyond the gross domestic product.
The biggest challenge is the historic assumption that there is no relationship between the financial system and sustainable development. And that has been a policy assumption for many decades. It's now changing. And I think in terms of the opportunity we have following the global financial crisis, I think there's a recognition that the financial system is there to serve the needs of the real economy, productive enterprise, and so on. And clearly, in the 21st century, that needs to be done in a green and inclusive fashion. So I think the challenges then are to work comprehensively across different sectors, different countries, to see where environmental and social factors are placed within the incentives that drive capital, the information flows, and also the responsibilities. So I think the challenge is to bridge this gap between the financial system and sustainable development policies. And the opportunity is now, because I think we're in a moment of time when there's a realization that the financial system needs to serve the long-term needs of the real economy.
Ethiopia sees climate change both as an opportunity and as an obligation. And we see RED as important, as equally important as other sectors, because we see that there are benefits as well as co-benefits. The benefits are by involving into the RED activity, afforestation, forestation, and so on, we increase our soil fertility, and of course we can really increase our GDP contribution. And at the same time, with regard to the co-benefits, by just clearing the atmosphere or by sequestering the greenhouse gas from the atmosphere, we increase air quality, we increase water quality, and so on and so forth. So we are involving in the RED activity, saying for ourselves. It's not like, of course, the international negotiation has to put a cap on the emission level of the developed countries. That's going on. But while that is going on, we cannot sit because Ethiopia has chose to go to the green path of development by just abating 1 ton of carbon dioxide. We calculated it, we spend only $10, but we get more benefit, 10 times benefit from that.
The recurring question is, why should this be critically important to all of us? The reality is that understanding overall stocks of natural capital and monitoring stock changes is vital at a national level.
There is a natural alignment to these, and I think one of the solutions over this period is for naturally long investors to really get their mind around whether they can play a role in this transition to a green economy, be investing in things that are essentially longer term and make the transition for us. It's not the only thing we could do. We could tackle short-termism in a number of ways. We can tackle transparency, which is another important issue. I frequently ask people, are you a member of a pension fund or do you have a bank account? They say yes. I say, do you know where your pension fund or your bank uses the money that you deposit with it? And they say no. That's not the case everywhere, but in general, I would really like to see one of the things that we could fix would be a lot more consumer and actual demand to understand in transparency what is being financed, to what purpose, and with what outcome by the money that I actually invest in the system.
This understanding informs policy interventions and highlights whether countries are really creating new wealth and well-being or simply converting one form of capital into another. Until now, corporate accounting and business models have failed to account for the natural resources that form crucial part of each company's supply chain, with these factors being considered infinite and free. However, the depletion of natural capital poses a major strategic risk with the potential to impact financial performance through loss of revenue, reduced profitability, and constrained cash flow. Natural capital depletion is set to become a major challenge for businesses in the 21st century as population growth and climate change exacerbate the demands on the Earth's resources.
The way ecosystems work is that you cannot indefinitely just put more carbon into the forest or into the oceans, for that matter, which are already becoming acidic because of increased carbon uptake. There are tipping points in ecosystems. So we have to limit and put a cap on, or a price as it was earlier,